Evening, folks. Pull up a chair. Let the fire warm your bones. Joe Rivers here, welcoming you back to Voices of Justice. Tonight, tonight, we journey back to a time when the land was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. A time etched in dust and desperation, resilience and redemption. We're heading out to the Arizona Territory, late in the 1880s. Picture it, the sun beaten down like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil of cracked earth. The horizon shimmers, promising relief it rarely delivers. Out here, life clung on by a thread, and fortunes, well, they could turn faster than a tumbleweed in a dust devil. Sometimes, all that stood between a soul and ruin wasn't a loaded colt or a fast horse. Sometimes, it was just the quiet strength found deep within, a strength forged in the very fires meant to consume it. Tonight's story, it's about a woman named Elara Vance, a widow, left with little more than grief and dust. But fate, you see, sometimes hides its greatest gifts in the deepest shadows of loss. And sometimes, the wolves don't just circle the flock. Sometimes, they wear a friendly face and offer a helping hand, right before they try to snatch everything you've got left. Stay with me now as we unravel a tale of hidden maps, buried secrets, and the kind of courage that blooms even in the driest, hardest ground. The dust hadn't even settled proper on Arthur Vance's grave when Silas Croft came calling. Elora watched him ride up from the porch of the small, weathered ranch house, his horse kicking up little puffs of ochre that hung in the still, hot air. Croft was a man built solid, like the brick bank he owned back in Redemption Gulch, the nearest cluster of buildings that dared call itself a town. He wore town clothes, dark and a little too warm for the season, but neat, always neat. He dismounted with the practiced ease of a man comfortable with horses, though everyone knew he preferred the sturdy predictability of ledgers and deeds. Elara remained standing, her hands clasped tight at her waist, the black fabric of her morning dress absorbing the relentless sun. Grief was a heavy cloak, heavier even than the wool, but it didn't entirely numb the prickle of unease Croft's presence always stirred in her. Arthur hadn't trusted him. He'd never said why, not in so many words. But the warnings were there, in the tightenings of his jaw, the way his gaze would linger on Croft a moment too long after they'd spoken. "Watch him, Elara," he'd murmured once, mending tack by the barn light. "Smiles easy, but his eyes are countin'." Croft removed his hat, revealing thinning hair plastered to his scalp with sweat. He offered a smile meant to be sympathetic, but it didn't quite reach those calculating eyes Arthur had warned her about. "Mrs. Vance, Elara, my deepest condolences. Arthur, he was a good man, a hard worker. This territory won't be the same without him." "Thank you, Mr. Croft," Elara replied, her voice quiet but steady. It felt strange, using the formalities. Arthur had just called him Croft, usually with a faint edge to his tone. "Just Silas, please," he insisted, stepping onto the porch, bringing with him the faint scent of bay rum and town dust. In times like these, well, neighbors ought to look out for each other. Redemption Gulch feels this loss keenly. Elara nodded, unsure what else to say. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzz of unseen insects and the distant, mournful lowing of one of the few remaining cattle. The ranch, Hard Scrabble, as Arthur had grimly named it, was barely hanging on before the fever took him swift and sudden. Now, with him gone, it felt like the dust was already reclaiming it. Croft cleared his throat, shifting his weight. Alara, I know this is a difficult time. The worst time, truly. But, well, practical matters have a way of intruding, don't they? He gestured vaguely towards the parched land stretching out around them. Arthur. He had a small note outstanding at the bank, and the property taxes are coming due soon. Alara's stomach tightened. She knew about the loan, a small one Arthur had taken out for seed last spring when the rains failed. The taxes, she'd pushed the thought away, buried under the immediate weight of nursing Arthur, and then the funeral. I know, Mr. Croft, she managed. I'll sort something out. Croft's sympathetic expression deepened, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing. Of course, but ranching, it's hard work, Alara, especially for a woman alone. This land, it demands a strong hand. Arthur poured his life into it, yes, but even he struggled these last few years. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I wouldn't want to see you lose it all, to see Arthur's hard work disappear. I'm not planning on losing it, Mr. Croft. Her voice had a firmer edge now, a spark of defiance kindled by his pitying tone. No, of course not. Croft said smoothly, but sometimes the wisest course is to cut one's losses, move on, perhaps back east, where you have family. Alara flinched inwardly. She had no family back east, not anymore. Arthur had been her family. This ranch, this harsh, demanding land, was all she had left of him. I don't have family back east, she stated flatly. Croft feigned surprise. Oh, I see. My apologies. Well then, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence. Look, Alara, I've always respected Arthur, and I respect you. As a gesture, and purely out of neighborly concern, mind you, I'd be willing to take the ranch off your hands, settle Arthur's debt at the bank, cover the back taxes, and give you a fair price besides. Enough to start fresh somewhere. Maybe Prescott, or even Tucson. Somewhere easier. He named a figure. It sounded substantial, perhaps, to someone unfamiliar with land values. But Alara knew, even in her grief-stricken state, it was low, pitifully low. Arthur had always said the true value wasn't just the grazing land, poor as it was, but the access to Scorpion Creek, meager as it flowed most years. Water was life out here. Croft's offer barely covered the value of the small cabin and the few head of bony cattle. That's generous of you to offer, Mr. Croft, Alara said, choosing her words carefully. But I need some time to think, to grieve. Croft's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Take your time. But don't take too long, Alara. Debts have a way of growing like weeds in unattended soil. The bank, well, we have procedures. I can only hold things off for so long. The veiled threat was clear. He placed his hat back on his head, the brief moment of feigned sympathy evaporating like morning dew under the rising sun. You know where to find me when you're ready to be practical. He nodded curtly and walked back to his horse, mounting with a grunt. He didn't look back as he rode away, leaving Alara alone on the porch, the dust settling around her like a shroud. Practical. The word echoed in the silence. Practicality meant admitting defeat. selling Arthur's dream for a pittance, walking away from the only home she had. She sank onto the worn wooden bench by the door, the strength draining from her legs. The sun beat down. The air was thick with heat and the scent of creosote. Despair washed over her, cold, despite the inferno outside. Croft was right about one thing. It was hard country. Maybe, maybe too hard for a woman alone. Tears she'd held back finally spilled, hot and stinging, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She wasn't just mourning Arthur anymore. She was mourning the future she thought they'd build here, brick by painstaking brick, hope by stubborn hope. A future that now seemed as barren and cracked as the land itself. Days blurred into weeks. Alara moved through the motions of survival, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She fed the chickens, milked the single remaining cow, patched the leaky water barrel as best she could. The vast silence of the ranch pressed in, broken only by the wind or the cry of a hawk circling overhead. Loneliness was a constant companion, sharp-edged and persistent. She saw Croft again in Redemption Gulch, when she rode in for meager supplies. He tipped his hat, his eyes sweeping over her dusty, worn dress, the tired lines around her eyes. He didn't press her about the ranch, just offered another oily smile and remarked on the dry weather. He didn't need to press. Time, he knew, was on his side. The banker always won in the end. Back at the ranch, the weight of impending loss settled heavier each day. She knew she couldn't meet the debt, couldn't pay the taxes. Croft's offer, insulting as it was, began to loom as the only possibility, a bitter pill she'd have to swallow. One scorching afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat indoors, she decided to finally sort through Arthur's personal belongings. He hadn't owned much, just his clothes, his tools, a few cherished books, and an old, battered trunk tucked away in the corner of their small bedroom. Opening the trunk released the faint, familiar scent of Arthur, worn leather, pipe tobacco, and the clean smell of the lye soap he'd used. Inside lay folded clothes, a spare blanket, his father's tarnished silver watch that never kept proper time, and underneath it all, a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It looked like a ranch account book, something Arthur wasn't meticulous about keeping. Curiosity mingled with a fresh wave of grief. She lifted it out. It wasn't accounts. The pages were filled with Arthur's strong, slanted handwriting, but it wasn't numbers. It was a journal. He'd never told her he kept one. She settled onto the cool floorboards, leaning against the bed frame, and began to read. The entries spanned years, chronicling the back-breaking work, the small triumphs, the crushing setbacks of building a life on Hardscrabble Ranch. He wrote of the weather, the cattle, the struggles with fences and predators. But woven through the daily entries were observations, thoughts, worries he'd never fully voiced aloud. He wrote about Redemption Gulch, the shifting alliances, the whispers of fortunes made and lost. And he wrote about Silas Croft. Saw Croft today, all smiles and inquiries about the creek flow. Man's got eyes like a vulture circling a sick calf. Something about him. Sticks in my craw. Always asking about the South Ridge, the old prospector trails. Another entry, months later. Croft offered to buy the South pasture again. Says it's worthless rock, but his eyes say different. Told him no. Again. He don't give up easy. Reckon he smells something. Alara's breath caught. Smelled what? What was on the south ridge? Arthur had always discouraged her from going up there, said it was too rough, full of snakes and loose rock. She read on, her heart pounding now. Deeper into the journal, tucked between pages describing a difficult calving and mending a fence line shattered by a summer storm, she found it. Not written, but sketched. A rough drawing, lines and symbols etched onto the page in faded pencil. It looked like a map. Landmarks she recognized. The twisted juniper near the dry wash. The distinctive peak of Widow's Needle Mountain in the distance. The faint trace of Scorpion Creek. But there were other marks, symbols she didn't understand, leading away from the familiar creek bed up into the rugged, forbidding terrain of the South Ridge. An X was marked boldly near a cluster of symbols representing rock formations. Beneath the map, Arthur had written a single, cryptic line. Just in case Croft gets too hungry, maybe she'll know what to do with it. She. He meant her. Alara stared at the map, then at the words. A cold dread mixed with a dizzying surge of possibility washed over her. Arthur hadn't just been a struggling rancher. He'd been guarding a secret he suspected Croft was sniffing around, a secret he'd left for her. Her hands trembled as she carefully closed the ledger. What did the map lead to? The old prospector trails Arthur mentioned. Could it be? Gold? The word hung in the air, shimmering like a mirage. Gold fever had swept through these territories decades ago, leaving behind ghost towns and broken dreams. But sometimes the legends were true. If it was true, it changed everything. It meant she didn't have to sell. It meant she could fight back against Croft, against the crushing weight of debt. But it also meant danger. If Croft suspected Arthur had found something, his neighborly concern would evaporate fast, replaced by naked greed. He wouldn't hesitate to take what he wanted, one way or another. She looked around the small, dusty room at the meager furniture, the worn floorboards. This place, hardscrabble, suddenly felt different. Not just a burden, but a stronghold, a place holding a secret worth defending. Arthur hadn't just left her a map. He'd left her a challenge. Maybe she'll know what to do with it. A new resolve settled in her heart, pushing aside the despair. She didn't know if she could decipher the map fully, didn't know if she could face Croft, didn't know if there was even any gold up there on that treacherous ridge. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't surrender Arthur's legacy, whatever it truly was, without a fight. She carefully tore the map page from the ledger, folded it small, and tucked it deep within the bodice of her dress, the rough paper scratching against her skin. A hidden promise, a dangerous hope. The silence of the ranch no longer felt empty, but charged with secrets. And for the first time since Arthur's death, Alara Vance felt a flicker, faint but fierce, of something other than grief. It felt like purpose. The following weeks became a tense game of cat and mouse, played out against the backdrop of the parched Arizona landscape. Alara knew she couldn't let Croft suspect anything had changed. She maintained her outward appearance of a grieving widow struggling to cope, making her trips into Redemption Gulch less frequent, pleading hardship when anyone asked. When Croft cornered her outside the Mercantile one blistering afternoon, his solicitous mask firmly in place, She forced herself to sound weary and resigned. "Mr. Croft," she sighed, pushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. Things, things are harder than I imagined. The well's running low. Lost another calf last week. Coyotes, I reckon." Croft nodded slowly, his eyes missing nothing. "Tragic. Just tragic. As I said, Alara, this is no life for a woman alone. My offer still stands. Perhaps even a little more generous, given your current difficulties." He named a figure slightly higher than before, but still nowhere near fair value, let alone the potential value humming against her skin. I I appreciate it, Mr. Croft," she stammered, mimicking indecision. I'm I'm considering it, truly. Just need a little more time." "Time is a luxury few can afford out here, Alara," he said, his voice dropping slightly, losing its sympathetic edge. "The bank requires payment on Arthur's note by the end of the month. And the taxes, well, the county assessor isn't known for his patience." She nodded mutely, letting him see the fear she genuinely felt, though its source was now more complex than just debt. She scurried away, feeling his gaze follow her down the dusty street. He was getting impatient. She needed to act, but cautiously. Back at the ranch, under the secrecy of moonlight or the veiled hours of dawn, Alara studied the map. It was crude, drawn by a hand more used to holding reins than pencils, but Arthur had known this land intimately. She began to correlate the landmarks on the paper with the actual terrain she could see from the cabin. Widow's Needle, the gnarled sentinel juniper. The path started near the dwindling Scorpion Creek, then angled sharply upwards towards the forbidding South Ridge. She made short, furtive excursions, disguised as attempts to check fence lines or search for stray cattle. She carried an old Spencer rifle Arthur had kept, more for appearance than any real expectation of using it. Her goal was reconnaissance, learning the lay of the land Arthur had mapped, without drawing attention. The South Ridge was indeed treacherous. Steep inclines, loose scree that shifted underfoot, thorny brush that tore at her skirts and skin. Rattlesnakes sunned themselves on warm rocks, their warnings a dry, chilling buzz. It was clear why Arthur had warned her away. Each trip revealed a little more. She found the distinctive split boulder marked on the map, then the cluster of 3 weathered pinnacles that resembled praying monks. The path Arthur sketched wasn't a clear trail, but a series of subtle guides, a strangely shaped outcrop, a patch of unusually colored earth, a notch in a distant cliff face. It required patience and keen observation to follow. Doubt gnawed at her. Was this a wild goose chase? Was Arthur just imagining things, driven mad by hardship and suspicion? Then, one sweltering afternoon, while tracing a faint game trail Arthur seemed to have incorporated into his route, she found something that wasn't natural. Partially hidden beneath an overhang of rock, almost swallowed by overgrown mesquite, was the decaying remnant of an old wooden sluice box. It was ancient, weathered gray, collapsing in on itself. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, lay a rusted pickaxe head. Someone had prospected here long ago. Arthur hadn't imagined it. Excitement warred with fear. This was real. But the discovery also heightened the danger. If old signs remained, Croft, if he searched diligently, might find them too. She needed to understand the map fully, to find the precise location marked X before he did. Her supplies dwindled. The pressure from Croft, though unspoken since their last meeting, was a palpable weight. She knew his patience had limits. She began rationing her food, pushing herself harder, spending more time on the ridge, driven by a growing urgency. The physical toll was immense. Her hands were raw, her muscles ached constantly, and the relentless sun beat down, leaving her perpetually thirsty and exhausted. Yet, with each landmark she identified, each step closer to the X, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about honoring Arthur's foresight, proving Croft wrong, proving to herself she could survive, even thrive, against the odds. One evening, rereading Arthur's journal by the flickering lamplight, seeking clues she might have missed, she found another entry that sent a chill down her spine. It was dated only weeks before he fell ill. Think I found the source. Not a rich vein, maybe, but enough. Enough to clear the slate, maybe fix the north fence proper. Hidden it good. But Croft, he was up near the ridge again today. Said he was tracking stray stock, but he was looking too hard at the ground. If anything happens to me, Alara needs to know. It ain't just the gold. There's papers, too, hidden with it. Papers that prove what kind of man Croft really is. Tied up with the old Johnson Place auction. Sheriff Barton turned a blind eye then. Maybe these'll make someone see. Alara's blood ran cold. Papers? Evidence against Croft? Tied to the Johnson Place auction? She vaguely remembered the Johnsons, an elderly couple who'd lost their ranch a few years back under dubious circumstances. Croft had acquired the land shortly after, supposedly at a public auction, though rumors had always circulated about unfair dealings. About Sheriff Barton conveniently looking the other way. This changed everything. Arthur hadn't just hidden a potential fortune. He'd hidden proof of Croft's corruption, possibly criminal activity. The X on the map wasn't just a location. It was a potential powder keg. If Croft even suspected such papers existed, he wouldn't just try to cheat her out of the land. He would stop at nothing to silence her and destroy the evidence. Her dangerous quest had suddenly become infinitely more perilous. The secret she carried wasn't just wealth. It was justice, sharp and double-edged. Now, finding the X wasn't just about survival. It was about unearthing a truth that could bring down the most powerful man in Redemption Gulch. Arthur hadn't just left her a map. He'd left her a weapon, and the question wasn't just whether she could find the gold, but whether she had the courage to use the truth. The discovery of Arthur's journal entry about the papers galvanized Alara, lending a desperate edge to her search. Gold was a powerful lure, but justice? Justice felt like solid ground beneath her feet, a purpose beyond mere survival or wealth. She now understood Arthur's cryptic warnings, his deep-seated distrust of Croft. He hadn't just been protecting a potential claim. He'd been safeguarding evidence that could expose Croft's rotten core. Her excursions to the South Ridge became bolder, driven by the knowledge that Croft's patience was wearing thin and that the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. She memorized the map, tracing its lines in her mind even when she slept, correlating Arthur's crude symbols with the harsh reality of the terrain. She learned to move quietly, to read the signs of the land, to distinguish the track of a deer from the print of a man's boot. She finally located the last landmark before the X, a peculiar outcrop of quartz that glittered faintly in the afternoon sun, looking like a shard of frozen lightning embedded in the rock. According to the map, the spot marked X was just beyond it, in a shallow, hidden ravine choked with stubborn, thorny brush. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, she pushed her way through the tangled growth, the thorns snagging her clothes, scratching her arms. The air in the ravine was still and close, heavy with the scent of dry earth and sun-baked rock. And then she saw it. Not a mine entrance, not a glittering vein, but something far more mundane, yet carefully concealed. A section of the ravine wall looked slightly different, the rocks arranged with a subtle artificiality. Behind a particularly large, flat stone, wedged into a natural crevice, was a small, sturdy wooden box, weathered but intact. Her breath hitched. This had to be it. With considerable effort, she managed to pry the heavy stone aside. Dust billowed out. She reached into the crevice, her fingers closing around the rough wood of the box. It was heavier than she expected. She pulled it out into the dappled sunlight, filtering through the brush. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry grass, lay several canvas bags, tied shut with that twine. They felt heavy, lumpy. Gold nuggets? Dust? She didn't dare open them yet. Beneath the bags was what made her heart stop, a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. Hands shaking uncontrollably now, she carefully unwrapped the oilskin. Inside were several folded documents, yellowed and brittle with age, but clearly legible. There was a sworn affidavit signed by a man named Jebediah Stone, detailing how Silas Croft had conspired with then-Deputy Barton to undervalue the Johnson place at auction, using threats and fabricated debts to force the sale. There were copies of forged land deeds and a personal letter from Old Man Johnson to Arthur, written shortly before his death, begging Arthur to expose Croft if he ever found proof. Arthur had found it, and he'd hidden it, along with whatever gold he'd managed to pan or dig out, waiting for the right time, or perhaps leaving it as a legacy of truth for her to uncover. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of grief for Arthur's quiet courage, tears of fear for the dangerous knowledge she now possessed, and tears of a fierce, burning anger at Croft's calculated cruelty. She quickly rewrapped the documents, placing them carefully back in the box under the bags of gold. She replaced the heavy stone, doing her best to disguise the disturbance, scattering dust and leaves over the spot. Carrying the heavy box was impossible. Leaving it felt unbearably risky. She decided to take only the oilskin parcel with the documents. The gold could wait. The truth could not. She tucked the parcel securely inside her dress, the papers feeling like both a shield and a target against her skin. Getting back down the ridge was treacherous, her mind racing, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. Had Croft seen her? Had anyone followed her? The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the landscape. By the time she reached the relative safety of the cabin, darkness had fallen, and exhaustion warred with adrenaline. She collapsed onto her cot, the oilskin parcel clutched tight. She had the proof. But what now? Riding into Redemption Gulch and confronting Sheriff Barton, the man implicated in the documents, seemed suicidal. He was clearly in Croft's pocket. Presenting the evidence directly to Croft? equally dangerous. He would destroy the papers and ensure she never spoke of them again. She needed a plan. She needed leverage. She needed allies. But who could she trust in a town where Croft held so much power? Doubt crept back in. Maybe Arthur had been foolish. Maybe hiding the papers had been a mistake. Maybe she should just take the gold, disappear, and leave Croft to his ill-gotten gains. But the memory of Arthur's words in the journal, maybe she'll know what to do with it, echoed in her mind. And the image of the elderly Johnsons losing everything because of Croft's greed fueled her resolve. No, running wasn't the answer. Justice, however risky, was the only path that honored Arthur's memory and her own conscience. Just as she was trying to formulate a strategy, a hard, insistent pounding echoed through the thin wooden door, shattering the fragile quiet of the night. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, listening. "Elara? Elara Vance, open up!" The voice was rough, impatient, not Croft's smooth tones. She didn't recognize it. She crept to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. Two men stood on her porch, silhouetted against the moonlit yard. They looked rough, trail-worn, faces obscured by shadow and low-brimmed hats. One held a lantern, casting flickering, distorted shadows. They weren't townsfolk. They weren't ranch hands, she knew. Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound firm. She reached for the Spencer rifle, leaning against the wall, its cold metal a small comfort. "Friends of Silas Croft," the voice rasped back. "He sent us. Says you got something that belongs to him. Wants us to collect it. Open the door, ma'am, and nobody gets hurt." Croft knew, or suspected enough to send hired thugs. Her time had run out. Trapped in the small cabin, the damning evidence clutched against her chest. Elara knew the confrontation she dreaded was upon her, sooner and more violently than she could have ever imagined. The desert night, usually a refuge of quiet solitude, suddenly felt like it was closing in, tight and suffocating. Panic seized Elara for a terrifying moment. Two men, armed, most likely, sent by Croft. They wouldn't hesitate to use force. The cabin offered minimal protection. The door was flimsy, the windows easily shattered. The rifle felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. Could she even use it? Then Arthur's face flashed in her mind, his quiet strength, his determination. Maybe she'll know what to do with it. He hadn't expected her to be a gunslinger. He'd trusted her wits, her resilience. Think, Elara, think. They thought she had something of Croft's. They probably assumed it was the gold, or maybe just the deed to the ranch he coveted. They likely didn't know about the papers, the real leverage. If she gave them the map, they'd still search the cabin, find nothing else, and likely harm her anyway to ensure her silence. If she fought back directly, she was outnumbered, outgunned. Her eyes fell on the flickering oil lamp on the table, casting dancing shadows. An idea sparked, desperate and dangerous. Just a minute," she called out, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. I don't know what you're talking about." She moved quickly, silently. She grabbed the small, nearly empty tin of kerosene she used for the lamps, her hands surprisingly steady now. She took the oilskin parcel from her dress, her heart aching at the risk, but she saw no other way. She shoved it deep inside an old, empty flour sack hanging by the hearth, hoping the smell might offer some faint camouflage. The pounding on the door resumed, louder, angrier. "Don't make this difficult, Mrs. Vance. Croft ain't a patient man." All right, I'm coming." Ilara splashed a small amount of kerosene onto a pile of rags near the hearth, then dribbled a thin trail towards the door, careful to keep it away from the flour sack. She took the Spencer, checked that it was loaded, and flattened herself against the wall beside the door, hidden from immediate view if they burst in. "I don't have anything of Mr. Croft's," she shouted, her voice high with feigned panic. "Arthur left debts, that's all. Please, just leave me alone. Last chance, lady." The wood of the door splintered near the latch as a heavy boot kicked it hard. Taking a deep breath, Ilara touched the lit wick of the oil lamp to the end of the kerosene trail near the hearth. Flames flared instantly, racing along the thin line towards the door with terrifying speed. "Fire!" she screamed, pitching her voice high with genuine terror now, mingling with the calculated act. "Help! Fire!" Just as the flames reached the rags near the door, creating a sudden, alarming blaze, the door burst open. The two men stumbled in, momentarily blinded by the smoke and the unexpected wall of fire erupting near the entrance. "What in the hell?" one choked, recoiling. "She set the place ablaze!" the other yelled, swatting at sparks. This was her chance. In the confusion, smoke filling the small cabin. The men disoriented. Ilara slipped past them through the now open doorway and out into the moonlit night. She didn't look back. She ran towards the only other structure on the property, the small, rickety barn where she kept her aging horse and the few remaining tools. She heard shouts behind her, curses mingling with the crackle of the growing fire. "Get her! She's getting away!" Adrenaline surged through her. She fumbled with the barn door latch, her fingers clumsy with haste. Inside, the familiar scent of hay and horse calmed her slightly. Her old mare, Daisy, shifted nervously in her stall, whickering at the commotion. "Easy, girl, easy," Ilara soothed, grabbing the worn bridle. She had to get away, not just escape these thugs, but get to Redemption Gulch. Not to the sheriff, but perhaps to someone else. Doc Evans? Old Mrs. Gable at the Mercantile? Someone Croft didn't own outright. Someone who might listen, who might believe her, who might help spread the word before Croft could silence her permanently. She heard the men crashing out of the burning cabin, coughing from the smoke. One of them spotted her near the barn. "There she is, heading for the horse." No time to saddle. Ilara threw the bridle over Daisy's head, unlatched the stall door, and swung herself onto the mare's bare back, grabbing a handful of mane. She kicked Daisy's flanks, urging her towards the wide barn doors. A gunshot cracked through the night air, splintering wood near her head. Daisy screamed, rearing in terror, but Ilara clung on, digging her heels in again. "Go, girl, go!" They burst out of the barn, just as the two men reached it. Another shot whizzed past. Ilara leaned low over Daisy's neck, urging her into a frantic gallop away from the burning cabin, away from the ranch, heading towards the faint, distant lights of Redemption Gulch. The wind whipped her hair across her face, tears streaming from her eyes, from the smoke, the fear, the desperate hope. Behind her, the flames from the cabin leaped higher, painting the night sky orange and red, consuming her home, consuming the last vestiges of her old life. But clutched in her mind was the location of the gold. And hidden in the chaos, hopefully safe for now, was the truth in a dusty flour sack. She had escaped Croft's hired hands, but the race wasn't over. She was riding into the heart of his territory, armed with nothing but a desperate plan and the courage born of having nothing left to lose. The fire behind her wasn't just destruction, it was a signal, a point of no return. Elara Vance, the grieving widow, was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for her life and for justice. The ride to Redemption Gulch was a blur of pounding hooves, aching muscles, and raw fear. Elara clung to Daisy's back, the mare's powerful strides eating up the miles of moonlit desert. Every rustle in the sagebrush, every distant coyote howl sent fresh waves of panic through her. Were Croft's men following? Would they cut her off? Was riding into town, where Croft's influence was strongest, sheer suicide? She slowed Daisy as the first scattered buildings of Redemption Gulch came into view, looking more like dark, sleeping beasts than a haven. The town was quiet, most lamps extinguished. Only the saloon, the dusty spur, still spilled yellow light and faint, tinny piano music onto the deserted street. Where could she go? The sheriff's office was out. Croft's bank was a fortress of his power. She thought of Doc Evans. He was old, respected, and seemed to keep his own counsel. He'd tended to Arthur in his final days with kindness. But could he stand up to Croft? Mrs. Gable at the Mercantile? A good woman, sharp-tongued and observant, but involving her could put her in danger. Then she remembered Jedediah Harper. Old Jed Harper lived in a small shack on the edge of town, surviving on a small pension from his army days and whatever odd jobs he could find. He was considered eccentric, maybe a little touched by the sun, always muttering about conspiracies and injustices. But Arthur had occasionally shared a drink with him, saying Jed saw more than folks gave him credit for. And critically, Jed actively disliked Silas Croft. He'd lost his own small claim years ago in a dispute Croft had somehow profited from. Maybe, just maybe, Jed Harper was crazy enough and angry enough to help. She guided Daisy down a back alley, avoiding the main street, tethering the exhausted mare behind Jed's dilapidated shack. Smoke still clung to Alara's clothes. Her face was smudged with soot, her dress torn. She looked like a wraith emerging from the desert. She knocked softly on Jed's door. After a long moment, a querulous voice called out, "Who's there? Go away! Ain't got nothing worth stealing." "Mr. Harper, it's Elara Vance, Arthur Vance's widow." Her voice was raspy from smoke and exertion. The door creaked open a few inches. A pair of sharp, suspicious eyes peered out from a weathered, bearded face. "Mrs. Vance? What in tarnation? You look like you wrestled a wildfire." "Please, Mr. Harper, I need help. Silas Croft. He sent men after me. They burned down my cabin." The words tumbled out in a rush. Jed's eyes widened slightly. He looked past her into the darkness, then quickly pulled her inside, shutting the door firmly and sliding a heavy wooden bolt across it. The shack was small, cluttered, smelling of stale tobacco and something vaguely medicinal. "Croft?" Jed repeated, his voice low and intense. "Knew he was a snake. What did you do to rile him?" Elara hesitated for only a second. She looked into Jed's wary eyes and saw a flicker of something beyond eccentricity. a deep-seated resentment of injustice. She decided to trust him, at least partially. Arthur, he left something behind, something Croft wants badly, and something else. Proof, Mr. Harper. Proof of what Croft did to the Johnsons. Jed's jaw dropped. He stared at her, then slowly nodded, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes. The Johnson place. I always knew Croft played dirty pool there. Barton covered for him. He scrubbed a hand over his beard. Proof, you say? Where is it? Hidden, back at the ranch. In the flour sack by the hearth. If it didn't burn, the risk she'd taken hit her full force. Had the paper survived? Risky, Jed muttered. Those thugs of his, they'll be back looking for you. And Croft, he owns this town, lock, stock, and barrel. Owns the sheriff, too. I know, Ilara whispered, but I couldn't just let him win. Arthur wouldn't have wanted that. Jed paced the small confines of the shack. All right, we need a plan. Can't go to Barton. Can't fight Croft head on. He's got money, guns, influence. He stopped, tapping a finger against his temple. But maybe we don't need guns. Maybe we use what Croft values most against him. What's that? Ilara asked. His reputation, Jed said, a sly look entering his eyes. He pretends to be a respectable man, see? Pillar of the community. What if the whole town knew what he really was? What if those papers saw the light of day? How? Barton would confiscate them. Croft would deny everything. Not if we make it public, Jed countered. Real public. Sunday morning. After the preacher's done his sermonifying, folks will be gathered outside the church. Respectable folks. Croft will be there, looking pious. What if you stand up then, Mrs. Vance? Tell your story? Tell 'em about the fire, about Croft's men. Tell 'em about the Johnson papers? Ilara stared at him. Confront Croft in front of the entire town? Accuse him publicly? It was terrifying. They might not believe me. Croft will call me a liar, a hysterical woman. Maybe, Jed conceded. But doubt is like a seed, Mrs. Vance. Once planted, it grows, especially if folks already got their suspicions about Croft. And maybe we give 'em something more than just your word. He glanced towards a dusty shelf filled with old newspapers and pamphlets. Need to get those papers first, though, before Croft's men do. It was a long shot, fraught with danger. Retrieving the papers from the still smoldering ruins of her cabin, then facing down Croft in public, but it felt like the only path that offered even a sliver of hope for justice. All right, Mr. Harper, Ilara said, her voice firmer now. How do we get the papers? Jed grinned, a flash of white teeth in his beard. Leave that to me, Mrs. Vance. I know some back ways Croft's dogs don't. You rest here. Get cleaned up best you can. Tomorrow morning, Redemption Gulch is going to hear some truth. While Ilara tried to rest, washing the soot from her face and hands with water from Jed's basin, the old man slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. He moved like a shadow, through the alleys and gullies he knew so well, circling around town and heading back towards the Hardscrabble Ranch. He approached the site cautiously. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, thin tendrils of smoke still rising in the cool morning air. 2 horses were tethered nearby. Croft's thugs were still there, likely waiting for daylight to search the debris more thoroughly, or perhaps waiting for Ilara to return. Jed stayed hidden, observing. He saw the men, poking through the ashes near the collapsed chimney, close to where Alara said the flour sack had been. Jed's heart sank. Had the papers burned? Then he saw one of the men kick something aside in disgust, a partially burned, soot-covered sack. It looked insignificant, just more charred rubbish. Jed waited, hardly daring to breathe. After a few more minutes of fruitless searching, the two men mounted their horses and rode off, heading back towards town, likely to report their failure to Croft. As soon as they were out of sight, Jed darted towards the ruins. He located the discarded sack. It was scorched around the edges, but miraculously, the tightly packed flour remnants inside seemed to have insulated the contents. His fingers trembling, Jed reached inside. Beneath a layer of blackened flour, he felt it, the distinct shape of the oilskin parcel. He pulled it out. The oilskin was heat-wrinkled and stained, but intact. Clutching the parcel, Jed scrambled away from the ruins, his heart pounding with triumph and fear. He took a circuitous route back to his shack, arriving just as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky. He found Ilara pacing anxiously. He held up the grimy parcel. "Got him, Mrs. Vance. Safe and sound, or sound enough anyways." Relief washed over Ilara so intensely her knees almost buckled. She took the parcel, unwrapped it carefully. The documents were slightly singed at the edges, smelled strongly of smoke, but they were readable. The proof was real. It was in her hands. "Now," Jed said, his eyes gleaming. "You ready to face the devil in his own churchyard?" Ilara took a deep breath, clutching the papers. She thought of Arthur, of the Johnsons, of the life Croft had tried to steal from her. Fear was still there, cold and sharp, but determination burned hotter. "I am." Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. The bell of Redemption Gulch's small wooden church tolled, calling the faithful. Ilara, wearing a simple, clean dress Jed's wife had owned before she passed, walked beside Jed towards the church. Her head was held high, though her insides churned. The oilskin parcel was tucked securely inside her bodice once more. As they approached, they saw the townsfolk gathering, exchanging pleasantries in their Sunday best. Sheriff Barton stood near the entrance, his badge glinting, his face impassive. And there, near the front steps, holding court with the mayor and other prominent citizens, was Silas Croft. He looked immaculate in a dark suit, a picture of respectability, nodding graciously to passers-by. He hadn't seen Ilara yet. The service seemed to last an eternity. Ilara sat rigidly beside Jed, barely hearing the preacher's words about forgiveness and redemption. Her focus was entirely on what came next. When the final amen was spoken, the congregation began filing out into the sunlit churchyard. Croft emerged, smiling, shaking hands. This was the moment. Jed gave Ilara a subtle nod, taking another shaky breath. She stepped forward, moving towards the center of the gathering crowd, positioning herself directly in Croft's path. He saw her then. His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then cold fury. His eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Vance, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" His voice was low, menacing, meant only for her, but several people nearby turned, curious at the confrontation. "Mr. Croft," Ilara said, her voice clear and carrying, though it trembled slightly. I believe you sent some visitors to my home last night. A murmur went through the crowd. People stopped talking, turning their full attention to the lone woman facing the town's most powerful man. Sheriff Barton took a step closer, his hand resting near his gun. Croft regained his composure, adopting a look of puzzled concern. Visitors? My dear Alara, I have no idea what you're talking about. Perhaps the grief? There's nothing wrong with my mind, Mr. Croft, Alara interrupted, her voice gaining strength. 2 men came. They said you sent them. They wanted something you thought I had. When I wouldn't let them in, they burned my cabin to the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned towards Croft, questioning, suspicious. His face flushed crimson. This is outrageous, preposterous. This woman is clearly distraught, making wild accusations. Am I? Alara pulled the scorched oilskin parcel from her dress. She held it high for everyone to see. Then perhaps you can explain these, Mr. Croft. Papers Arthur Vance found. Papers proving how you and Sheriff Barton here cheated the Johnson family out of their ranch. Forged deeds. A sworn affidavit. The crowd noise intensified. People pressed closer. Sheriff Barton looked pale, his hand now gripping his gun. Lies! Croft spat, his mask of respectability shattering completely. She's mad. Sheriff, arrest this woman for slander, for disturbing the peace. Barton hesitated, looking from Croft's furious face to the accusing eyes of his fellow townspeople, then at the damning parcel in Alara's hand. For the first time, perhaps ever, he seemed uncertain of Croft's absolute power. Hold on there, Silas, a voice drawled. Doc Evans stepped forward from the crowd, his expression grim. Maybe we ought to see those papers, Alara. Mrs. Gable nodded beside him, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed hard on Croft. Others murmured agreement. Croft looked trapped, cornered. His eyes darted around, seeking escape, but the crowd hemmed him in, his face contorted with rage and desperation. That parcel is mine. She stole it. He lunged towards Alara, reaching for the papers. Jed Harper stepped in front of Alara protectively. Get back, Croft. Let the folks see the truth. Seeing his control slipping, his reputation crumbling before his eyes, Croft lost his head entirely. He shoved Jed aside, his hand darting inside his coat. Give them to me, he roared, pulling out a small Derringer pistol. Screams erupted from the crowd. People scrambled backwards. But before Croft could aim the pistol at Alara, Sheriff Barton, perhaps seeing his own future tied to Croft's sinking ship, finally acted. He drew his own Colt Peacemaker. Drop it, Silas, Barton commanded, his voice shaky but firm. Drop the gun, now. Croft froze. The Derringer aimed vaguely at Alara, his eyes wild. He looked from Alara's steady, accusing gaze to Barton's leveled gun, to the shocked and hostile faces of the townspeople who had, moments before, treated him with deference. He was ruined. He knew it. Slowly, trembling with fury, Silas Croft lowered the Derringer and let it fall to the dusty ground. Sheriff Barton quickly kicked it away, and with a palpable sense of reluctance mixed with self-preservation, moved forward to apprehend the man he had served for so long. Silence fell over the churchyard, broken only by a few choked sobs, and the sound of Barton handcuffing a suddenly deflated Silas Croft. Alara stood tall, still clutching the scorched parcel, the proof of Croft's crimes and Arthur's quiet fight for justice. She had faced the devil, not with a gun, but with the truth. And in the harsh light of the Arizona sun, for the first time in a long time, justice seemed possible in Redemption Gulch. The dust was settling, not just from the confrontation, but on Silas Croft's reign of greed. Elara Vance had found her voice and her strength in the very ashes of her despair. The aftermath was swift, yet profound. With Croft under arrest and the documents presented, singed edges and all, the carefully constructed facade of Redemption Gulch cracked wide open. Sheriff Barton, eager to distance himself from his former associate and save his own skin, cooperated fully, corroborating the details in the affidavit. Faced with incontrovertible proof and the testimony of a suddenly emboldened sheriff, Silas Croft's legal defense crumbled. His trial was short, his conviction assured. The man who had built his empire on whispers, veiled threats, and exploited vulnerabilities found himself stripped of his power. His land holdings eventually auctioned off, this time fairly, to settle his debts and provide some restitution, including a measure for the surviving members of the Johnson family who were located living in modest circumstances in another territory. Elara found herself the reluctant center of attention. Townsfolk, who had previously offered only pity or kept a wary distance, now approached her with respect, even awe. Offers of help rebuilding her cabin poured in, along with donations of furniture, livestock, and supplies. Jed Harper became her staunchest ally, his earlier eccentricity now viewed as crusty wisdom. She accepted the help gratefully, but modestly. The community barn, raising for her new, slightly larger cabin, was a symbol of healing, not just for her, but for the town itself, purging the poison of Croft's influence. Yet, amidst the rebuilding and the newfound respect, Elara felt a quiet sense of detachment from the events. Exposing Croft hadn't brought the triumphant satisfaction she might have expected. It felt necessary, right, but the cost had been high. And then there was the matter of the X on the map, and the bags of gold still hidden in the ravine on the south ridge. Once the immediate chaos subsided, Elara, accompanied by a watchful Jed, made the arduous trek back up to the hidden spot. The wooden box was still there, undisturbed. They carried it back down, the weight of the canvas bag significant. Back in the privacy of Jed's shack, Elara stayed with him until her cabin was rebuilt. They finally opened the bags. They contained not glittering nuggets, but a substantial amount of coarse gold dust and small, irregular pieces, the result of patient, painstaking labor. It wasn't a king's ransom, not the kind of strike that started a gold rush, but it was enough. Enough, as Arthur had written, to clear the slate, fix the fences, and then some. Enough for a secure future. Jed whistled softly. Arthur was a persistent fella, dug this out of sheer hard rock and hope. Elara looked at the gold, shimmering dully in the lamplight. It represented security, freedom from debt, the ability to run the hard-scrabble ranch without the constant fear of ruin. But looking at it, she also saw Arthur's secret labor, the risks he took, the burden he carried alone. And she saw the greed it had ignited in Croft, the violence it had brought to her doorstep. She made a decision then, one that surprised even Jed. She used a portion of the gold, anonymously, to ensure the Johnson family received more than the court-ordered restitution, enough for them to truly start again. She paid off the remaining mortgage on Jed's shack. She used some to properly restock her ranch, buy sturdy fencing materials, and hire a reliable hand, a young man named Ben, whose family had also suffered under Croft's thumb. The rest? The bulk of it? She kept it secure, but she didn't hoard it or flaunt it. It wasn't the foundation of her new life. Her own resilience was. The gold was merely a tool, a means to solidify the independence she had fought so hard to win. Hardscrabble Ranch began to slowly flourish, not through luck or buried treasure, but through hard work, careful management, and the quiet strength Elara had discovered within herself. She learned to read the land, manage the cattle, make decisions with a confidence that grew stronger each season. She never sought retribution against Sheriff Barton. His public humiliation and diminished authority seemed punishment enough in the small world of Redemption Gulch. He kept his job, but walked straighter, his eyes avoiding Alara's whenever they met. Life on the frontier remained hard. The sun still beat down, the rains were still fickle, and challenges always lay over the next rise. But Alara Vance faced them head on, no longer just a grieving widow, but a woman forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal, sustained by the memory of her husband's hidden courage and her own surprising strength. The map Arthur left her had led to gold, yes, but its true treasure was the path it forced her to take, a path towards uncovering not just Croft's corruption, but her own unwavering spirit. She had learned that justice sometimes required more than laws. It required ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. And she learned that the richest veins weren't always buried in the earth, but deep within the human heart, 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 within the human heart.